Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or GBNews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
With 100 protests planned for tonight alone, I asked the question with my panel, are people beginning to lose faith in the democratic process? Because if they are, we're in very real trouble. Labour have announced a big change in terms of social housing. They won't be banning people involved in rioting, but they've also got Operation Scatter, where those that cross the channel will leave hotels and go into private and social housing. What political fallout will come from that? And as a result of net zero, we're hearing leaks from the national grid that we could expect blackouts across the southeast of England by 2028. Have we literally lost our minds? But before all of that, let's get the news with Sophia Wensler.
Nigel, thank you. Good evening from the GB Newsroom. It's just gone 7 o'clock. Your headlines. Police are aware of at least 100 protests and 30 counter-demonstrations planned for this evening, with hundreds gathered in Hackney and Walthamstow in London already. A list of immigration law firms has been shared in an online chat group with a possible target for gatherings, which the Director of Public Prosecutions has warned could be considered a terrorism offence. It comes as one case of alleged terrorism is already actively under consideration. Police are urging people to ignore the list of locations, telling rioters officers will be waiting. It comes as at least 12 individuals have been convicted for their part in the ongoing disorder. Speaking a short time ago, Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner said there's no excuse for thuggery.
I know that the public will be feeling anxious about the reports of potential more unrest tonight, but the police will be there to respond to any violent and criminality that we see on our streets. There's no place for that on our UK streets, and the police will do their job like they have done exceptionally well under very difficult circumstances like I've seen here and witnessed today what they faced, missiles being thrown at them and attacks, but the police will be there to keep the public safe, and there's no excuse for thuggery and criminality on the streets.
However, speaking last night, the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, called for Labour government to be more accountable.
This is why we have to have the questions, the scrutiny to the Home Secretary and to Keir Starmer, because actually the police need to have the tools, the equipment, the backing to police in the right way across all protests. Doesn't matter who, but literally all the protests where we're seeing thuggery, violence, criminality, everyone that's involved in that. These protests should be policed. I've seen footage on television, I'm sure you have as well. I saw some on social media last night from one part of the country where I saw no police. I want to know why that was. Why was there no police presence?
It comes as the Metropolitan Police Commissioners dismissed accusations of two-tier policing, calling it complete nonsense. The criticism came from figures including Nigel Farage and Elon Musk, who argued that last week's disorder was handled more severely than it would have been if ethnic minorities were involved. And it's understood MPs have been told to work from home ahead of possible violent disorder tonight. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle has told elected representatives to exercise caution amid fears immigration and asylum assistance offices could be among the targets. MPs are thought to have been told home working is one option to bolster their security, and Commons spokesperson has warned MPs' safety is a fundamental to our democracy. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. I'm Sophia Wensler, more in an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Good evening. It's not stopping. It could even be accelerating. We're told intelligence says there are up to 100 protests planned tonight across the country and up to 30 counter-protests. And whilst we all hope and pray we don't get the scenes of violence that we've seen over the course of the last week, none of us at all can be confident that that is the case. I wonder, because I fear that we may be in a perilous position. Why do I say that? Well, the bedrock of how we settle disputes, of how we govern ourselves, is we vote. We go and we argue against each other, and we have a government that is elected, and we might not like that government, but we accept that the majority have voted for somebody other than ourselves, and we say, you know what, we're going to work hard over the course of the next 5 years so that our team win next time round. That is parliamentary democracy. That is what works. That is what maintains the peace. You don't need to go out and riot and protest and set fire to things, all the while you've got confidence in your parliamentary system. My fear, and I'm certainly seeing this from people that write to me and email me, is we're beginning to see, particularly in the younger generation, a growing number of people who just don't think democracy functions, just don't think it works for them, just don't think that promises that get made at elections are actually carried out. And that concerns me. One of the other things that has led to such ill feeling in the country is two-tier policing. Now, we had a fierce debate last night here about whether two-tier policing exists or not. Well, I'll tell you something. There is a very widespread perception that it does. Let's just see this from Craig Guilford, Chief Constable of the West Midlands Police, speaking earlier on today.
Salam alaikum. There is one tier of policing that applies to all of us, and that means that we police without fear or favour. Shukran.
I don't think coming out with foreign languages addressing one particular community in the West Midlands makes an awful lot of sense, does anything to dampen down speculation about two-tier policing. And extraordinarily, Emlyn Richards, the superintendent of the West Midlands, was asked, how was it that a large number of masked men, some carrying dangerous weapons, were allowed to go outside that pub in Birmingham? One man came out, was beaten to a pulp, was finished up with a lacerated liver, windows were smashed, the pub doors were locked for safety. How is it that wasn't being policed? And extraordinarily, what Superintendent Richards said, we had the opportunity to meet with community leaders prior to the event to understand the style of policing that we needed. So you ask a group of counter-protesters, what policing do we need? And they say, absolutely none whatsoever. And the police say, that's fine. The point I'm making is nothing is being done by the police or by the government to get rid of this perception of two-tier policing. And none of that is helpful in any way at all. I'm joined to discuss the implications for democracy, for law and order, for our society, by Ranil Jayawardena, former Environment Secretary and International Trade Minister, Member of Parliament from 2015 to 2024, and Joe Phillips, Paddy Ashdown's former Press Secretary and former editor of Radio 5 Live's Sunday Service programme. But first I'm going to go to immigration lawyer and friend of this programme, Ivan Sampson, who joins me down the line. Ivan, you and I have debated the legal and illegal immigration situation in Britain regularly over the course of the last 3 years. What do you think has led to this massive upsurge in violence, and does it surprise you?
No, I think there's been some terrible rhetoric by the previous government blaming migrants for much of our woes. The lack of housing, the pressure on the public services. And it's simply not true. Look, we have a legal duty to protect those that have come to this country, whether they're migrants, whether they're asylum seekers. We have legal obligations under international treaties. And especially those that are coming for protection. We don't want to prosecute those people that are seeking protection from being persecuted abroad. It's a terrible look for our country.
If we were to take out for a moment the numbers that have come into Britain and claimed asylum, but talk about the levels of legal migration, the population increase of 6 million since the Conservatives came to power, surely then the arguments about shortage of housing, lack of access to GPs, problems with infrastructure, surely then there is some logic that says that mass immigration has made life harder for many millions of people.
But look, the data doesn't bear that out. If you look at actual legal migration, they actually give a positive impact on our economy. That's the data. Whereas I agree that if the census, if the feeling in the nation is that we shouldn't have so much mass immigration because they don't share our values, then the government should instill policies to reflect that. But what we can't do is ignore people's feelings. I'm with you on that, Nigel. There's a lot of people who have strong feelings against the way that our society is being moulded by people who don't speak our language, don't share our values.
Yeah.
I'm with you on that. That's a debate that needs to be had.
But this only works, Ivan, if people get what they vote for. And some would argue that repeated promises have been made to lower the overall numbers coming to Britain, and the opposite's happened.
Absolutely, and the Conservatives are the worst. I mean, it's increased the most under their watch. So, absolutely, it's very difficult to get migration down when there's a commercial need for it. We don't have the people to fill the jobs. So we need to recruit our local people. We need to have proper training so that in the long term, we can put British people for British jobs and not foreigners.
Ivan Sampson, as ever, thank you for joining us and giving us your opinion. Well, Ranald, it's all your fault. You've put out terrible narrative that people's lives are being devalued by mass immigration, whilst at the same time your government opened the doors in a way never seen before.
Well, I like Ivan, but that was, I'm afraid, rather incoherent. He's absolutely fair to say that immigration has been too high and that more needed to be done. That was why the scheme like Rwanda was important, to send a deterrent. But here's the problem right now. You've got a Labour government who are going to allow a full open door and allow people to come here, whatever.
I don't think Ranald, I'm really sorry. I don't think that a party that promises in 4 consecutive general election manifestos net migration figures of tens of thousands a year and produces 750,000 a year can really have a go at the Labour Party.
Well, the Labour Party are the party in government right now, and people are unhappy with some of the things that the current government are doing. They've scrapped the Bibi Stockholm, haven't they? They are going to scrap the RAF camps that were going to be used. They're going to use government housing.
We're going to come to that later in the programme. Am I right to worry that a growing number of young people are losing faith in the democratic system and that turns them towards violence?
You're right to worry about it. Clearly, as you said, elections are the place that people should fight for what they believe in, not violence on the streets on whatever side of the argument people are in. And we saw in the general election, we're seeing now people use violence or indeed threatening behaviour to try and intimidate others. That is what is wrong.
For one of the first times, Joe, ever, the Liberal Democrat share of vote, a number of MPs actually reflected what people voted for.
Absolutely.
Not the case for other parties, but I'm not going to delve deeply into that.
No, I think it's the one thing you and I agree on, is proportional representation.
But do you see my point? That I genuinely believe, just when I see the email box that comes to me...
But, Nigel, I would say to you, if you believe in parliamentary democracy, which is about the only thing that keeps us vaguely on the straight and narrow, why didn't you ask the question that you asked on Twitter in Parliament? Because, wait a minute, let me just finish, because I think what we have to remember, perhaps has been forgotten in the news coverage today, the inquest's open today into the deaths of those 3 little girls that were murdered in Southport. 2 weeks ago, their lives, their families absolutely upended, a town in shock. If the person who had done that had been white, or the little girls had been Asian or of a different, would you have gone on Twitter and asked the same question? Basically raising a question, raising suspicions and fueling what was already going around, that this person with a fake name was an illegal asylum.
We have to say alleged murder at this stage, just for legal reasons.
Yes.
When Parliament debated it, it was an expression of sorrow. It wasn't the time for political comment. When the London Bridge murder happened, We learnt within an hour that the person had been on a police list. Whenever there was an atrocity in Northern Ireland, the first question anybody asked is, was this person under investigation? Over a week ago, there was all sorts of nonsense going around on the internet, which, had it been slapped down, I think the Southport riots would not have been as bad as they were.
Did you slap it down?
I asked one very simple question that would have slapped it down. Was this person on a list or not? And do you know what? I still haven't got an answer.
But you didn't say this is untrue. I didn't go along with any of the conspiracy theory that he'd come on a boat last October, etc. I ignored all of that. It would have been enormously helpful if the Home Office and the police had told people very quickly that whoever this man was, he was actually born in Cardiff. They did none of those things. And I think the silence made what happened in Southport worse. But now where we are is much more serious. Now where we are is much more serious, but you should have used the parliamentary democracy.
I had no means to do it at that time.
Of course you did.
No, I would have been, if I'd got up and asked... You're an elected MP. If I'd got up and asked a political question like that at a moment of expression of sorrow, it would have looked appalling.
Well, it didn't look particularly good on Twitter. And
well, I'm sorry, I disagree entirely. I think it was a very fair question, a legitimate question, and it's still not been answered. But when Parliament comes back, I will answer it.
But isn't the point that actually nothing that someone might say on Twitter, or indeed in the House of Commons, should condone the violence that's happening?
No, absolutely.
And that's the point here. People should not say that they've got any excuse for the behaviour that we're seeing on any side.
Renault, I fought elections for 30 years. I've never been involved in any violence or street protests of any kind at all. I utterly condemn what is going on. I know there are problems out there in the country, but my real worry here is a growing number of people are losing faith in democracy.
And I'm afraid that it is not helped by, as Ivan Solomon just said, your I presume still party, Ranel, but, your former colleagues like Suella Braverman, who stoked up the woke wars, the culture wars, and used language like invasion and talked about
What would the Lib Dems do about the cross-channel problem?
The Lib Dems would have done something to clear the backlog. I mean,
just let everyone stay.
No, part of the problem is the backlog, and you know that, and you know that. Because they're sitting... people are waiting, some of them for up to 2 or 3 years, in hotels, waiting for their asylum to be processed.
No, the problem is that people are coming to the country illegally.
I tell you what we'll do. After the break, we will come back, we will discuss the backlog, and we will discuss Operation Scatter, which is the Labour government's plan to take people, young men who've crossed the Channel, out of hotels and to put them into social and private housing. We'll ask whether that's a good policy. All of that in just a moment.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom. Weekday mornings from 9:30.
We're joined now by GB News national reporter Charlie Peters, who is outside Buckingham Palace for us.
Well, let's start with the expenditure, shall we? From the last year, it was £89.1 million. That's what the royal household spent. And one of the core parts of that expenditure was, of course, their big event last May, the coronation. £800,000 went into that. And then we should look at the engagements. You mentioned the number that King Charles made last year. Well, £4.2 million on those engagements, much of that travel. And then finally, how much that costs us all? Well, it's £1.29 per person. That's the cost of the monarchy to the taxpayer. But that really hides the truth of how that cash comes about, because all of the money that the royal household spends is actually theirs being given back to them by the Treasury. It comes from the Crown Estate surplus. That's a £16 billion portfolio they have, and their sovereign grant is made up of the surplus from 2 years prior. So in the year to 2022, there was about £350 million knocking around from the surplus. That was given all to the Treasury, and they were given back 15% as their core sovereign grant. Additional 10% was given towards the resurfacing of Buckingham Palace. That's been going on since Parliament voted on it in 2017. It's expected to take 10 years. But all in all, that's been about £86.3 million. And as you heard, the expenditure was £89 million. So how do they mix that gap? How do they close that gap in and cost out? Well, they make their own money as well from additional sources of income, and that was the gates, the receipts to Windsor Castle and their many palaces across the country where people have paid about £10 million to visit in the last year.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or GBNews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, the boats are still coming. Over 17,000 have come so far this year over the English Channel. The ratios are about the same as ever. It's 91% men, most of them very young. But the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, laid out last Friday a statutory instrument that will allow the government to process the 100,000 or so asylum seekers that are stuck in the backlog. The government believes by clearing the asylum backlog, by speeding up processing, they'll be able to eliminate the need for larger sites altogether, those larger sites being RAF Wethersfield, Scampton, the Bibby Stockholm, etc. Huge backlog left behind by the last government. Is the Labour policy just to say everyone can stay?
Well, that's exactly the problem, right? So this is going to encourage more people to now make that perilous journey across the Channel. You know, ultimately, we want no one to cross because that saves lives and it reduces this problem here. And no one can possibly suggest that France is not a safe country. It's really interesting, of course, they've cancelled the Rwanda plan before we had a chance to have it. And now what's the Italian government doing? They've got a plan very similar with Albania. So this is just going to now...
The Italians have done something like that. That is true.
So
Joe,
I mean,
it's basically the policy, just it doesn't matter who comes, just
No,
stay.
I don't think it is at all.
It sounds like it, doesn't it?
Well, only in your head, Nigel.
I just read you the statement.
I know, but that is not what it means. What it means is if you look at the cost, the huge cost of preparing these RAF bases. You know, the last government said it was going to be 5 million, and then it went up to 27 million for one of them or the other. And there is no doubt that when you were an MP, Ranald, I'm sure, whether there was one in your constituency, people would have gone, we don't want that there, we don't want that large mass of people. So that seems to me to make sense. But if you start processing people, you send back the ones that don't have any right to be... Well, if people have come from... We've already seen people return to Albania under the last government.
Apart from Albania?
Where
almost nowhere.
India?
Almost, I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it?
Well, it's very difficult.
It's very difficult because we're stuck with ECHR, is what I would argue, but let's move on.
Well, no, let's not go down the ECHR
Well, I'm
route.
afraid that's what stops us.
Well, it isn't. It's because the previous government, allowed the backlog to increase, and every now and again they'd come up with another wacky idea. Rwanda would have cost a fortune and would have probably had one plane taken off, would have taken... you know, a couple of boatloads of people.
I mean, the idea was
Hugely
it was to be a disincentive, but it never ever happened. Now, Operation Scatter is the new plan, and that means I think the peak was 420 hotels that were completely filled around the country, but Labour have got a much better plan. We won't use visible hotels, we won't use visible military sites. What we'll do is we will scatter people amongst social housing allocation and amongst the private rented sector. It will no doubt be more expensive than the £8 million a day we're paying for the hotels. But here's the point. You know, in February, the government launched a consultation on eligibility for social housing, having a UK connection test, a local connection test, etc. Yet we find out that in areas like Brent, up to 40% of new tenancies in the last couple of years went to non-UK nationals. And I just wonder...
And do we know whether any of those people working in the health service? Do we know?
No, we don't know.
We don't know.
Just
so
know.
we're just jumping to conclusions.
I tell you what we know. There is a large feeling in the country that people who come in from outside get things that those who are born of generations of people that have worked and paid tax don't get. That perception is quite widespread. Doesn't Operation Scatter make that worse?
No, I don't think it does, because I think when you come out with things like that that are taken completely and utterly out of context, foreign nationals may well be here perfectly legitimately working in the health service, which we don't have.
Because we don't train nurses anymore.
That's right, and we've had 14 years of a Tory government that didn't invest in any training for all the jobs that we did.
That's not true. That's just not
Well, actually, to be fair to Joe,
it is true.
You know, we have actually started to rely more on agency nursing from abroad. We did, in fact,
social care.
We capped the number of people going to medical school to train as doctors. These were mistakes.
Well, why is that number capped? Because the BMA want it capped. I mean, I agree with that point, that we should be allowing as many people... Hang on. We should be allowing as many people...
social care, we could be here for hours.
...who want to train as a doctor to do so. But the problem here, I agree with Joe in terms of, if people are contributing to our economy or our society, then fine. And those statistics, may not be found, but they may be anecdotally true. But the real problem here is scatter means that it will be hiding the real problem, which is people being housed at the government's expense, i.e. the taxpayers' expense. That's what people are really concerned about, because that's where people feel a sense of injustice, that other people are getting something that they are not.
And that's the point, Joe, isn't it? There's this very strong point here that, let's say you've got, a husband or daughter, very young, they've got a young kid, they're on the social housing list, the wait is 12, 14 months, 15 months, whatever it is.
If you're lucky. If
you're very lucky. And then suddenly you're told, really sorry, but it's 18 months now, because a lot of people across the English Channel are now moving into that social housing. This will make resentment deeper.
Well, it will only make it deeper if those people jump the queue. There are many, many people on housing...
Hang on, where are we going to put them? On the streets?
Well, at the moment, as far as I understand it, the government is calling on private landlords and has agencies. So they're looking at places like student accommodation. They're looking at places where there could be HMOs, houses of multiple occupation, care homes that are no longer in use. There are many different ways of doing it. It has got to be better than plonking hundreds of people in an area where nobody wants them. And can I just suggest that, I don't know if Yvette Cooper has thought about this, but if Baby Stockholm is not going to be used for asylum seekers, quite rightly, what about all the rioters going on that while they're
the Lib Dems are in favour of prison ships, is that right?
For this lot, yeah.
I promise you, Ed Davies not going with that. No. That is absolutely not going to happen.
But, maybe then people would understand and have a look at this.
The other problem is this, that there's also the private rental sector, because young people can't afford to buy houses.
No, and part of that is Airbnbs and second homes.
Hang on a second. Private rentals have gone up, on average. Scotland's slightly different, but across England and certainly South Wales, private rentals are up roughly 25% since 2021. It's an extraordinary increase. The amount of housing stock available for rents going down, again as a result of government policy. If the perception, again, is that because we're putting tens of thousands of people into private rentals, it's pushing up rents. I just have a feeling, I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that Operation Scatter will be even less popular with the public than booking hotels.
Well, I think that people also are extremely fed up, and I can't imagine there's anybody watching this that doesn't know somebody, a son, daughter, nephew, granddaughter, who can't get on the housing ladder. Now, that is a multifaceted problem. Part of it is the lack of building of affordable homes. Part of it is the inability and the stupidity in not transforming town centres and repurposing retail outlets where, the bottom's fallen out of retail, high streets are dying around the country.
And that change is coming.
Well, yeah, it will come.
That change is coming, but do you accept that the population explosion is the main reason we have a shortage of housing and expensive prices?
No, I think part of it is... No, but it's in parts of the country, Nigel. It is much, much worse.
So 10 million
in London, in the
south east. Since Tony Blair came to power, the population's up by 10 million. And 85% of that...
It's a lack of housing.
85% of that is directly down to immigration.
I don't agree with that. I don't believe
that. It's a fact. We have to build...
85%.
Of the 10 million increase is directly down to immigration. Nearly all of it legal, by the way, since 1997.
Precisely. So
and nearly 6 million of it since the Tories came to power. I mean, I'm just trying to argue logic with numbers.
But if it's legal immigration, then we need those people. We need them here for the economy, for businesses, for jobs that we have failed to train people to do.
Look, on the failure to train, and on sending far too many people to university to get degrees that aren't vocational.
Yes.
I would agree completely with you. I think Mr Blair sent us down the wrong route. I think we conned a lot of young people into building up big debts and not helping themselves. I agree with that with you 100%. But we can't deny the logic that on current immigration numbers, we have to build a new dwelling every 2 minutes in this country just to cope with that.
Well, you know,
and this is what you guys did.
Well, ultimately, there will be a need for new housing in the right places, including particularly in cities. Again, I'm sorry to bang on about it, but Labour's now reduced the number of homes to be built in London.
I'm really sorry, Randall. I'm just not buying it.
Can I just make another point, though, which is that in terms of the legal migration, you know, yes, there is, of course, the need for some people to come to this country to contribute to our economy, to contribute to our public services. But the big problem, of course, as has now begun to be clocked by countries around the world, is that in the Western world, we're not having enough children. And so in order to be able to staff up our public services, in order to be able to pay for our future liabilities, our pensions, our benefits, we've either got to have more children or we will need to continue to rely on legal migration. And I'd like to see more of the former.
Well, you know something?
And you're beginning to sound dangerously Republican. Let's get the women back home, barefoot and pregnant.
Did I say that?
Did I say that? I think that came out of that.
I tell you what's
Implication.
What is interesting is both of you say, well, you know, obviously the numbers are quite high, but it's good for the economy. And this has been the argument that's been put. It's good for the economy because it means GDP growth. I think it was really interesting. In the last 2 years, we've had record levels of net migration. 1.5 million legal net migration in the last 2 years under Rishi's premiership. And yet, in that period, we had 6 consecutive quarters of falling GDP per capita.
Yes.
So the country's economy getting bigger, but individually, the country getting poorer.
You're absolutely right to talk about GDP per capita. That is the metric that we must look at, and that's why immigration needs to be tightened up, so it's driving only that and supporting the public services. I think you're right to say that you've got to draw that line, but I come back to the point that the only way that sustainably you grow the economy is to have more children being born in your own country in the first place.
And how's that going to happen?
And that's going to...
I'm not sure government policy can really influence that.
We
could encourage
it
through a tax system, but it's not going to make that big a
But
difference.
one of the problems is if you can't afford to get a house, either to rent or to buy, you're going to put off having
Which is
kids.
why Operation Scatter is going to make it worse.
Comes back to the beginning.
In a moment, we're going to debate a story that has had very little coverage today, but I think it's quite significant. It is pro-Palestinian activists storming in to a factory in Bristol this morning, smashing the place up, using sledgehammers, injuring police forces, officers, injuring staff. I mean, I understand that the riots, the distress that's causing around the country is the major news. But I begin to ask, you know, are there elements now of the pro-Palestinian campaign that we need to give much more serious thought to? Because it seems to me this is a form, frankly, of industrial terrorism.
Evening. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Tomorrow's going to feel pretty warm and humid, and after a dry start for many, it's going to turn dull, with quite a few of us seeing outbreaks of rain and drizzle. Not from this area of low pressure, but actually from this rather innocuous-looking set of weather fronts. The low to the north, though, is still providing some hefty showers across northern Scotland. Still pretty gusty here as well. A blustery night across the far north. Elsewhere, the winds are easing. There'll be some clearer spells. A few showers across northern England, but they're tending to fade. And then we'll see the cloud, rain and drizzle spilling into South Wales and southwest England later in the night. Quite a warm night here. Elsewhere, with some clearer skies. Temperatures, certainly rural spots, could dip down to single figures. So for many, it is a bright start to Thursday. There'll be some sunshine around. Still quite gusty across the far north of Scotland with a few showers. But for much of Scotland, looking drier tomorrow with some decent spells of sunshine. Will cloud over across the southwest as the cloud and rain spills into northwest England and parts of the south of Northern Ireland. A very different day for Wales and southwest England tomorrow. A lot of cloud, rain and drizzle on and off for much of the day, particularly over hills and around the coast. Whereas the Midlands and eastern England, after a dry, fine start, will just steadily cloud over. Rain trickling into parts of the Midlands, spreading across more northern parts of England. Some heavier bursts of rain possible later in the day. Not much rain for East Anglia in the southeast, just turning cloudy here, and the far northeast of Scotland also mostly dry. Temperatures 19, 20, maybe a little higher in the southeast. It is going to feel really quite warm and humid, however. The rain and drizzle will be still across the south early on Friday, but it should scoot away. Showers in the northwest, but for many, Friday's set fair, a much brighter day for Wales and southwest England for sure, with some good spells of sunshine and a fresher feel. Showery rain on Saturday, and it is likely to hot up again as we go through the weekend.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes,
She could have saved Storm.
you made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Quite extraordinary story that a Palestine action group this morning, using a prison van that was marked up, ram-raided into Elbit Systems Horizon facility. This is an Israeli company making arms in this country, which are being exported to Israel. They went in, smashed the place up, vandalised it. They injured 2 police officers with sledgehammers. I mean, it was pretty nasty stuff. Staff were physically attacked as well. And I just begin to think that so much of this Palestine action, so much of this free Palestine, so much of this argument for justice actually is heading down a very bad, dangerous and violent route. Joe, a story that I think without the riots perhaps would have been a bigger story.
Yes, I think it would have done. I mean, it was a tiny little bit and only in the sort of the bigger paper. Where was that footage from? Was that
Bristol.
their footage?
Yeah, that's from a CCTV
Oh,
cameras.
CCTV, OK, all right. So it's not the... And now we have to be careful, obviously, because I understand there have been arrests.
There have been 6 arrests.
Yes.
We don't know who they are.
And we don't know anything else, any charges or anything else.
But are we now up against, is this sort of free Palestine movement now something that's moved, again, just completely beyond the law?
No more than the people who are out tonight chucking bricks at police officers. I mean...
Which is even more worrying, that it's happening on a bigger scale across more issues.
I mean, people feel deeply and passionately about what's happening in Gaza for the right reasons. And on both sides, you know, the attacks on October the 7th were absolutely appalling and atrocious. But what has happened subsequently and the human suffering to women and children and the way that people have been herded up and shunted and then attacked and UN agencies attacked. I mean...
Well, UN agencies actually had some of their staff involved in the atrocities, and now the Labour government's going to refund them,
because
which is extraordinary.
Those people have been sacked. They've been sacked, and they were sacked on the spot. But there was the food convoy, and that wasn't an accident. That was one truck after another picked off by IDF
Do you know what?
snipers.
We can argue on both sides. We can argue those things. But Ranul, this sort of, this is extraordinary behaviour, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm afraid it's part of a trend, which is that if folks are not held to account by the law enforcement authorities, then they become emboldened. And whether that's protests or whether that's...
the marches, the pro-Palestinian marches, some of the chanting.
Well, not only those marches, but I think there is a read across between those marches, these organisations and other organisations like BLM. I'm afraid to say that there is a hard left group of people in this country who will sign up for any campaign. I understand it's perfectly reasonable to feel very strongly about these issues. I do too. But again, there is a group of people in this country on the hard left who want to take direct action.
Well, there are on the hard right, and we've seen for the last few days.
For sure.
Well, these are the people... We're almost back to where we started,
But there is
aren't
one
we?
difference. The marches that were taking place through London were organised marches, and they were organised with the corporation or with with the talking to the police.
But they committed criminal damage, just like here.
Well, and they chanted things that shouldn't have been allowed.
And people were arrested. For Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary at the time, to call them hate marches was absolutely ridiculous. We've now seen Robert Jenrick, the next wannabe Tory, can I be even more right-wing than Reform, saying that anybody saying Allahu Akbar should be arrested.
Well, whether that was taken in context,
well,
I don't know. But I tell you what, I told you, this leads us on beautifully to a debate on free speech.
Right.
Because this is the what the Farage moment. Do you remember the counter-disinformation unit set up, as Boris said, to combat the false coronavirus information online? But, of course, as we know, in the end was used to crack down effectively on people who dissented from agreeing with lockdown or we should be jabbed repeatedly or whatever it may be. Well, it's now been reformed and renamed the Security Online Information Team. So that sounds pretty harmless. And this is there to monitor the protests. There's even talk today that anyone sharing footage of the protest might themselves have committed, an act that's outside the law. I can't see that applying to broadcasters, but hey. And then, of course, into all of that, we have the man who says he is an absolutist for free speech, Elon Musk. And we've got to ask ourselves what kind of country we want to live in. Is Elon Musk a force for good or bad in your view?
He's absolutely evil.
Evil?
I think he is absolutely evil. I think he is a disgrace. He's got no responsibility. He doesn't care what goes out on his platform. He is a disruptor. He's quite happy to peddle disinformation, misinformation and hatred, and he's only interested in it because he is playing and using people like puppets.
Wow.
I was at a really interesting conversation the other day with the former head of MI5, who now retired, who said, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought about worrying about, whether we were going to fight a land war in Europe with tanks and guns and things, which is what's happening in Ukraine. We were looking at fighting cyber war. And he said we had already lost that battle then because the forces that are using the technology to send out misinformation and disinformation are so agile and so mobile, and half the people who are reacting to them. And if I hear one more fully grown, sentient being, whether they're a Tory councillor's wife or a want-to-be Labour MP saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I didn't think. Well, think before you hit send.
Joe, I think Musk's a hero. No, I genuinely do. I think free speech is really important, even if it causes offence. I think this really matters. I think if Twitter, as it was then, had been owned by him, the American public would have known the truth about Hunter Biden's laptop. What say you about Musk and free speech?
Free speech is a cornerstone of our society, and we are so lucky to live in a country where that is true. I mean, there's so many countries around the world who don't have the freedoms that we do. But, the left use Twitter as much as the right. I've had my fair share of abuse on it too. I try not to spend too much time on Twitter, I must say. And I think David Cameron had his choice phrase, which I shan't repeat, about what he thought about Twitter. The point is that people will find ways to communicate with one another. That is a perfectly natural thing. And if Twitter is the platform or not is irrelevant.
Well, if it's not there, it'll be somewhere else.
Exactly.
Well, a lot of passion there on Elon Musk. In a moment, let's talk about net zero. Because apparently the National Grid have said in private it could mean total blackouts in the southeast of England by 2028. Are we losing our marbles on over-relying on wind and solar?
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Fatima's UK campaign, Children and Young People Matter, because I actually run a campaign, and my ministry today is about looking after children in the care system and improving their life outcomes. You know, for me, I had a difficult start to my childhood, and I will never forget it. I mean, I always say I may have left the care system, but the care system hasn't left me. And I instantly understand the importance of giving our young children and young people the opportunity to also, you know, have good life outcomes. So Fatima's UK campaign is all about that. And it's a summit next year. Eamon, I hope you're going to come.
No, and we've talked about this before, and certainly, I mean, I believe in what you're doing. I think it's marvellous what you're doing, and that's why, you know, when you think about children, and children are so close to you, and you look at that horror that happened in Southport yesterday, I mean, things like that
exactly.
will really hit home hard.
Well, children are the innocent ones, aren't they, Eamon? And this is what we look at when you think they're the future. We've got to start to put them back at the top. And it's a travesty when we see things like that, you know, Omar, that happen. You know, children are the ones that are impacted. And, you know, it's, for me, you know, it's really important to be able to do the best we can and looking after their future. And so hopefully, you know, I'm going to the Pyrenees in September, Eamon. That's my next challenge, the Bay of Biscay, from France to Spain and back. And hopefully people can go online, fatimascampaign.com, and give generously to help make a difference to these young people's lives. Because, as I say, children are the future.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now, I've long been deeply sceptical about renewable energy, not because I'm against it, because I didn't like the extent to which we had to fund it through taxpayers, but I worry above all about intermittency and long-term about cost. Well, a report out, and we have heard these before, but this time it's different, because this time it comes from National Grid executives in a private briefing warning there'll be blackouts in the southeast by 2028 unless we put in place zonal pricing, and that would mean people in the southeast paying a lot more for their electricity than the rest of the country. Now, Donovan McCarthy, climate activist, Climate Media Coalition, regular on this programme, great enthusiast for renewable energy. Intermittency and cost are still problems that we haven't yet overcome in any way, have we?
We have overcome it.
How?
Well, Nigel, the Telegraph has been warning us about blackouts for 15 years.
Yes, that's true.
15 years ago, renewables were at 2%. They're now at 40%.
On a good day?
For the last 6 months, 40% of our energy came from renewables. And the intermittency has been handled by a smarter grid. And what that does, two things. It makes it cheaper, and it means we have to build less infrastructure. And what has happened in the last 15 years is the price of renewables they were 15 years ago, you're right, they were expensive. We had to invest in them. Now,
and the poor paid for it.
Now they are cheaper than fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency said wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy. And what's happened over the last number of years, we no longer need subsidies for new renewables. And so what I'm saying for bill payers is that the more we invest in renewables, the cheaper their bills will be. And secondly, as somebody who actually rightly believes in protecting our borders and energy security, moving to renewables removes us from the risk of yet another fossil fuel global oil shock.
Let's just make one thing very clear. This is not a Daily Telegraph story. This is different in the sense that this is... But hang on, but this has come from National Grid executives themselves.
In the Daily Telegraph.
And you talk about... Yeah, but it's not an editorial story in that sense. You talk about infrastructure. We're looking at vast swathes of Suffolk, Essex, Norfolk, Lincolnshire, having the most enormous pylon systems driven through them. And the National Grid themselves estimate that to decarbonise the grid could cost in excess of £2 trillion. What we're embarked upon here is potentially phenomenally expensive.
No, whatever energy we choose, we will have to build power plants over the next 30 years. We will have to either build renewables, which are upfront costs and no running costs almost, or we build fossil fuel plants with massive running costs over the next 30 years.
What about nuclear?
Well, somebody, Nigel, who's always caring about bills for consumers. I don't understand your obsession with nuclear. Nuclear is twice. Look at what happened with
base load power.
Look what happened to Hinkley Point.
Yeah, well,
it was supposed to be built 10 years ago.
George Osborne,
and it's now 45
George
billion
Osborne made some horrific mistakes. Don has
why go down the nuclear route?
Don has a huge advocate for this, but I still question this intermittency problem, Joe.
Well, but the zonal thing makes sense. He's absolutely right. This is a Telegraph story. It's written by a Telegraph reporter who presumably is the person.
It's not denied.
It's not denied by executive.
It was denied
but it is.
It's not been denied.
But it is somebody who has had a chat with a Telegraph reporter and put a story out.
Are you entirely confident of the direction we're going in with renewables?
I want more renewables.
You do?
Yes, absolutely. And I want every single house, and this should have been done years ago. I mean, Nick Clegg famously said, "Oh, there's no point in doing nuclear. It'll be 20 years before we get the benefits." In the coalition government. Now, he did make some mistakes. That was one of them. No, every single house should have been equipped with solar panels. Every single new build should have double water things. Nigel, you and I were talking before we came on air about that state of the seas.
By the way, I've always been an environmentalist. I do care about the environment. I do care about habitats. I do care about these things.
Well, it's going to cost money, and at some point we have to
But I also care about the fact that our electricity is amongst the most expensive in the world. I care about the fact we've deindustrialised more quickly as a result of net zero policies than any other comparable Western country.
One of the things...
And we've got damned expensive electricity.
But look at what has happened to the economy. People keep talking about the price of electricity. You're right. Yes. The unit price of electricity is more expensive. But the economy has grown 80% when we cut our carbon emissions by 50%. So we've done exactly what we needed to do. We increased our wealth.
Well, hang on.
And we actually reduced our carbon emissions.
We are going back to 1990 on this. And we have lost some very important strategic industries like steel because we're uncompetitive.
We were going to lose those because of the price of energy, but the price of labour. And the interesting thing, you talk about interest and cost, and you talk about you say as your environmentalist, which is great to hear you support environmental. I looked up before I came in here tonight, Clacton. I looked at the vulnerability of Clacton as a constituency to sea level rise. Seawig, Jaywig. By the 2030s, looking at annual flooding, and we were spending £50 million to protect them.
We could live in caves in this country and make no difference to this at all.
No, but actually...
No difference at all.
That's an interesting... What percentage of global investments does Britain represent in new fossil fuels?
Minute now.
15%.
And going down rapidly.
15% is huge. We're only 1% of the world population.
Nigel,
everyone accepts we'll be... Hang on a second. Everyone accepts we will be using oil and gas still in the next couple of decades. So we may as well produce our own. Ranil, where do you stand on this? I mean, you were part of a government that was wildly enthusiastic for net zero policies.
Well, having cleaner air, having more energy security is a good thing, but that only comes from having a mix. And so, yes, build more offshore wind, fine, great. We produce more than any other country in the world, bar China. But the idea that we shouldn't be harnessing our own offshore oil and gas is absolutely insane. And that's exactly what the government's just done by cancelling the licences, cancelling the process that was going to happen under us in the last Parliament. Also, it's deeply troubling to hear the suggestion that simply because someone might live in a certain part of the country, they're going to have to pay more for their electricity. This is absolutely absurd. It's wholly unfair on
a lot of things.
People in
a lot of things in the southeast are rather expensive already.
One of the interesting things about this, actually, hopefully we're all agreed, zoning, this regional pricing would be mad. We've already had regional pricing with the privatisation of the water industry, so some people paying for the water bills get a pay £100, and other people are clobbered with £600. That's mad. And the other thing about it, what's really interesting about investment in renewables, is that it's part of levelling up. If we have zoning that London pays higher prices, all the renewables would be built in the southeast. That's a disaster. It needs to be built in the north and northwest to have those jobs and level up.
We could level up with lots of oil and gas jobs in Scotland and the northeast of England. But we'll have a debate there. We will come back to it in the months and years to come. But following on from me, Jacob is not around today, but we're going to have Chris Hope, our political editor, is doing State of the Nation. What have you got for us tonight, Christopher?
Nigel, we've got Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's a Cabinet Office Minister, giving us the government's response to its approach towards the riots. We're asking about two-tier policing. Is the far right to blame? All the questions that our viewers want to hear the answers to. And also Rupert Matthews, he's the Policing and Crime Commissioner for Leicestershire. We also hear from Andy No, and he's the individual, the Brit, who's been subtweeted by Elon Musk over the past few days. What's it like being in Musk's target? And a very, very
I tell you
good
what,
panel.
we've had a
So
heated
see
debate about Elon Musk, a heated debate about everything, actually. But tell you what, let's have a look at the weather.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Evening. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Tomorrow's going to feel pretty warm and humid, and after a dry start for many, it's going to turn dull, with quite a few of us seeing outbreaks of rain and drizzle. Not from this area of low pressure, but actually from this rather innocuous-looking set of weather fronts. The low to the north, though, is still providing some hefty showers across northern Scotland. Still pretty gusty here as well. A blustery night across the far north. Elsewhere, the winds are easing. There'll be some clearer spells. A few showers across northern England, but they're tending to fade. And then we'll see the cloud